All right, good afternoon, everyone. Evening, whatever time it is, 4:02. My name is Smitty. I'm going to be talking about amateur radio. Specifically, the question is, why is amateur radio still relevant today in the age of the internet, right? So it used to be a lot easier to explain why I was an amateur radio operator. I could say, well, me and my buddies, we have radios and we could talk to each other across town. We got a repeater up on the university, the tall building at the university, and we can talk to each other around town when we're driving around or trying to figure out where we're going to go for food or whatever. And this was before cell phones, right? And I had this radio and I could talk to my friends whenever I wanted to. Well, now I've got a cell phone and everyone's got a cell phone, and I don't have to, I'm not limited to just talking to amateur radio operators. I can talk to literally anyone else, right? So that argument kind of went out the window. But I've made friends all over the world, and I can talk to them over amateur radio because I've got the big antennas that talk all over the place. And that argument kind of flew out the window when we got the internet, right? Now I can talk to people all the time on the internet. I don't need amateur radio for that anymore either, right? So the argument of why am I an amateur radio operator used to have very practical answers. And we don't really have those practical answers anymore because cell phones, cheap long distance, cheap internet have pretty much supplanted the practical aspects of amateur radio almost exclusively. And even as hams start using the internet for a lot of things. There's a thing called Echolink, which is supposedly ham radio, but it's all over the internet, so I'm not really sure how it's ham radio, but that's a different discussion. And so the question I get asked a lot is, why are you an amateur radio operator? Why are you still an active ham? What do you enjoy about it? What is it that keeps drawing you to it? And I've spent a lot of time thinking about that, and I kind of want to share some of those answers with you guys today. One other thing, I'm very good about being interrupted and answering questions. So if you have any questions or want me to expand on something, or if I glazed over a detail that you want to learn more about, yell at me or raise your hand or spit wad or something. Let me know that you want me to go into more detail on that, or I will. If I start dwelling on something and I'm like, okay, Smitty, we get it, move on. That's where the spit wads are probably good. Let me know and I'll move on. So why amateur radio? And the short answer is, like all other hobbies, because it's fun. If it's the kind of thing that you're into, some people paint miniatures, some people knit, some people do a lot of things that aren't practical, but they enjoy it. It is still fun for them, even though it costs them a bunch of money, even though it doesn't really do anything for them, it's still something that they enjoy. Ham radio triggers a lot of that, right? That's kind of the short answer. That's a summary. But I do have... Give a talk on Friday, they said. It'll be fine. Your voice will be okay, they said. Thank you very much. But I do have a lot of practical reasons of why amateur radio is still very relevant. The first and foremost is, to be perfectly frank, when the shit hits the fan, amateur radio is going to save the world, right? When I live in California, I live on the coast in California. When the next big earthquake hits, I'm going to be in beachfront property, even though I live like 10 miles inland, right? I'm going to have beachfront property. None of the cell phones are going to work. The telephone network is going to be down. Anything that involves infrastructure, the power grid is going to be down, right? You have these big natural disasters, and all of our centralized infrastructure that we rely on isn't working. My amateur radio still does, right? For me to talk to my friends around town does not require any infrastructure at all. It's just my radio and my friend's radio. It's me talking around the world. I can get out of the local area. I can literally talk all over the country, all over the world, if I've got the right radio with me, without any infrastructure. The only thing I require is the ionosphere in the sky. My radio, the other person's radio, and the ionosphere between us, right? So in emergency situations, it is something that will always work when your cell phone doesn't, when your landline doesn't, when your power doesn't. Right? So that is one very practical reason. There are various different groups. The biggest one is called ARES, Amateur Radio Emergency Services, ARES. And it is a nationwide organization that is specifically targeted toward getting people trained and practiced on dealing with emergencies and running what are called nets, where you have a bunch of people all on the same frequency talking to each other and passing messages and making sure that they get the important messages through. Earthquakes are a good example. They set up a Red Cross shelter somewhere, and that Red Cross shelter needs to get a message to another Red Cross shelter that, we're running out of blankets, whatever, right? Whatever the message is. You put hams in there, Aries gets activated, and amateur radio operators go to these places, and they talk to each other over the amateur radio because the cell phones aren't working. And this Red Cross Center says, I need more blankets. This one says, I got a bunch of extra blankets. We'll send someone over, and you send somebody over, right? So we do these kinds of things all the time. As a way of practicing for these, as a way of practicing for these, a lot of amateur radio operators also get involved in various community service type things. So where I live in San Luis Obispo, California, there's a triathlon every year called the Wildflower Triathlon. It's one of the biggest in the world. And the club that I belong to has provided communications for the Wildflower Triathlon for many years. So it's kind of the same situation. It's not an emergency, but we have a controlled network. We're all talking on our radios with our own infrastructure, and we're passing messages. I'm also a motorcycle rider, and I've got a radio on my bike. So my position is usually as a chase vehicle. I'm chasing the lead cyclist around this 57-mile bike ride around the lake, and I give position updates periodically. Hey, we just passed mile marker 30 or whatever. Or the person in the lead is number 27. Oh, number 54 just passed number 27 and now 54 is in the lead, right? Those kinds of pieces of information that when you're out in the field, the folks at the grandstands don't get to know. And so we as amateur radio operators, as a practice for emergency situations, do these non-emergency community event things, right? A lot of fun, actually. I've been doing that one for about 20 years, and it's one of my favorite events to do. So those are some of the practical reasons to be ham. Some of the more fun reasons, it's a challenge, right? We're all nerds. We all don't like our lives to be too easy, right? We want to do something that's going to challenge our brain. Sometimes there are a lot of things that we can do. Sometimes they're kind of forced, imposed challenges, but sometimes just the conditions are kind of weird. So, for example, there are a lot of contests in amateur radio. And a contest is where you get on the air and you try to talk to as many other hams as you can. And usually there are some sort of constraints, right? Like the Kansas QSO party. So there are a bunch of people in Kansas, and they want to talk to people in the other states. And you, as another state, want to talk to as many people in Kansas as you can, right? That's kind of an artificial constraint, but it's something to kind of make it unique or whatever. Field Day is another big one. Field Day is probably the biggest amateur radio event, at least definitely in the United States, and I think globally as well. And it is the fourth full weekend in June, and the idea is all the amateurs get their stuff together, pack it up in a truck or whatever, go out to a field, literally a field, someplace that is not your normal home station, and you set up in an emergency-like situation where it's not you're not plugged into the grid, you're not your antenna that's on the tower at home, right? You have to set up something in the field for whatever reason, and then you get on, and for 24 hours, you are trying to talk to as many other amateur radio operators as you can. And it's this very kind of fast dynamic of an exchange, and it's a lot of fun. Contests are a lot of fun. The other one that I've really been doing is called National Parks on the Air. National Parks on the Air. So this year is the 100th anniversary of the U.S. National Park Service. And as kind of a celebration of that, the amateur radio community is doing this thing called National Parks on the Air, where hams like me who have mobile gear, I've got radio in my car, I'll go drive to a national park somewhere, set up, and start talking to other hams. And I'm what's called an activator. I activate the park. And I announce ahead of time on the internet, say, I'm going to be at this park at this time. If you're looking for this park, then, be on the air at this time. And then there are chasers who are trying to talk to as many of the different parks as they can. There are like 400 and some odd different parks that can be activated. And I think I've activated 10 of them so far. So it's a lot of fun. So those kinds of contests where it's a challenge, and we just like doing challenges. Another one is called, excuse me. Another kind of self-imposed challenge that a lot of hams like to get into is what's called DX, or distance. DX is kind of short for distance transmission. How far away can I talk to somebody, right? I'm here in the United States. I might want to talk to somebody in Brazil, on the Southern Hemisphere, or Australia, or Europe, or Kazakhstan, or North Korea, or wherever. There are these. The world has been split up into what are called different DX zones, And some zones are incredibly populated. Like, you're not going to find anyone who says, golly, I really need that California zone because we got, millions of hams in California, so that one's easy to get. But there hasn't been anyone operating out of North Korea for decades. And there's one guy who thinks he can get into North Korea and permission to operate with a North Korean call sign. He's working on it. He says he's going to have like 6 hours notice. And so he's going to announce to the whole world, all right, guys, I'm in. Let's go. And he's going to hop on a plane, go operate for a few days, and then hop on a plane and get back home, right? So DXing is kind of fun. How many different countries can I talk to? DXpeditions. So I just described that guy who's going to North Korea. A DXpedition is, I live in California, but there's this island over here that nobody really lives on, or there are very few people who live on it, and it doesn't really get on the air very much. So I'm going to get me and a bunch of my friends together. We're going to pack up our gear. We're going to spend $100,000 and go over to this island, set up for a couple of weeks, talk to as many people as we can, pack it all in, and go back home again, right? So that's called a DXpedition, where I'm explicitly going on a trip to a place that doesn't get activated very often to talk to a bunch of people, right? QRP. QRP is a term that means low power. So QRP radios are if you are operating with 5 watts or less. Again, it's one of those self-imposed power restrictions. It's self-imposed restrictions to make things more challenging, more difficult. Because, the radio I have at home is good for 100 watts. The radio I have in my car is good for 100 watts. We're allowed to do 1,500 watts. Right? So there's no reason that I have to use only 5 watts. But there's a certain challenge and a certain thrill for having a radio this big that I built myself with just a couple of AA batteries in there, and I literally just throw a wire in the tree. Tie a heavy rock to it over the branch, and I tie that wire to my radio, and I start working the world. I start talking to people, thousands of miles away from a hilltop with a wire in a tree and this little radio that I built myself, right? That's called QRPing. That's a whole other kind of self-imposed challenge. And these are all examples. I'm only going to touch on a few of the different things that we do. There are so many more kinds of things that are like this, but in different areas. So if what I'm talking about doesn't excite you, but you're kind of curious, go look for other things and see what other people are doing. So the International Space Station is, we know what the International Space Station, we got a big lab up in the sky, right? Orbits the Earth once every 90 minutes. There is an amateur radio station on the ISS. Every astronaut that goes to the ISS has an amateur radio license. Why? Because NASA doesn't trust their own gear. NASA wants a backup. Seriously, there is an amateur radio station on the ISS because if NASA's systems are not working, they know the amateur radio will. Right? So everyone on the ISS has an amateur radio license, and they can operate that radio if they want to. Occasionally, a lot of schools will get together and they'll schedule a time. The ISS may be within view of in your sky for anywhere from 30 seconds to 10 minutes, right? So if you've got a good overpass, it's going right above you. You can talk to the ISS for about 10 minutes. And so sometimes schools will schedule a time where they have a bunch of students in. The students have figured out what their questions are going to be, and they'll call up a question, and an astronaut will respond. And then the next student will come in and ask the next question and go up. It's called ARISS, Amateur Radio on the International Space Station, ARISS. It's a lot of, well, I can't say it's a lot of fun. I've never done it myself, but it's really cool. Yes?
When you talk to people, what do you talk about?
That is a very good question. Okay, so, yes, I will repeat. She asked, when you talk to people, what do you talk about? I got a confession to give you. I'm an extrovert, but I don't like making small talk, right? So thank you for asking me that question. One of the questions I get is great, I can talk to all of these people. Why do I want to talk to them? I'm not the right person to answer that because I also don't like small talk, right? So there are people who meet friends on amateur radio and they do what's called ragchew, where you're just on the radio and you're chatting and you're having a grand old time and you're talking about whatever you want. There are some rules. You're not allowed to cuss. You're not allowed to get into political discussions. I think there are some things that are technically off limits, but it doesn't stop anyone. There are a lot of people that do that. I'm not one of them. I don't like making small talk with people that I don't really know all that well. So those contests I were talking about, contesting is a great way to get on the air and be active for people who don't like making small talk. One of the reasons I've been so interested in NPOTA, National Parks on the Air, is because there is a defined exchange. The exchange is, I give you this piece of information, you give me this other piece of information, and we're done. So like an example of an NPOTA would be, so I'm going to do a little bit of role playing. I'm going to do both sides, all right? So when you are calling someone else, you are on the air and you are trying to find someone else to talk to, you do what's called CQ, literally the letter C and the Q. In Morse code, it's da-da-da-dit-da-da-da-da. It's a sound that is so easy to catch. Like you're just tuning around the band. If you just hear da-da-da-dit-da-da-da-da, you know that somebody is trying to find someone else to talk to, right? I don't know if this is actually where it came from, but this is the way I think of it. It's seek you. I am trying to find someone to talk to. I am seeking you. I don't know if that's actually where it came from, but it helps me remember. So a typical exchange for national parks on the air would be CQ, CQ, CQ. This is KR6ZY activating the Mojave National Preserve in Southern California. Papa Victor 13. Papa Victor 13 is the designator for that particular national park. All the parks have their own designators. And so I'll say CQ, CQ, CQ. This is KR6ZY activating national parks on the air. Papa Victor 13, the Mojave National Preserve in Southern California. Hint, I activated it on my way here. And then somebody else will say KR6ZY, this is 8060W. And then I'll say that, okay, 8060W, and then I'll do what's called giving a signal report. And I can tell them how strong their signal is, how easy it is for me to understand their signal. The first number is the intelligibility. It's between 1 and 5. 1 is, I got no idea what you're saying. 5 is, full copy, I know exactly what you just said. So, and then the second number is a number between 1 and 9, and that refers to the signal strength. And that there's a meter on your radio it's called the S meter. It tells you how strong the received signal is, and you just give them that number. So like a 5x9 means you got a very strong signal and it's 100% copy. Most people just cheat and just give 5x9 no matter what the report is because it's quick and easy and you don't have to worry about it. But so CQ, this is KR6ZY activating PV13. KR6ZY, this is 8060W. 8060W, you're 5x9 into Papa Victor 13. 5x9, I gave him the signal report into Papa Victor 13. That is the park that I'm in right now. Those are the two pieces of information I need to give to him. Thank you, I copy 5.9 in Papa Victor 13. Please copy, you are also 5x9 in Utah, right? So the exchange that he has to give to me is my signal report and what state he's in. And then I say, thank you very much for 5x9 in Utah. 73s, which means salutations. 73s is a way of saying like cheers, mate, or thank you, or aloha, whatever. It's kind of the ham equivalent of that. And a lot of these terms that you hear, like 73 and CQ, they come from the days of Morse code, and they sound neat. 73 is a very symmetric sounding thing. It's da-da, did-it, da-da. So it's kind of this weird, symmetric thing. And so that's where 73 comes from. And so I'll say 73 is QRZ, which means who's calling me. And then I call CQ again. And then the next person who may have been listening to our conversation and said, oh, there's somebody I want to talk to. Somebody who's activating Papa Victor 13. I haven't talked to Papa Victor 13 yet. I want to get that part. So they'll wait. And when I say QRZ, then they call me with their call sign. And you just keep going. And occasionally, you'll get what's called a pileup, where I call CQ, Papa Victor 13, blah, blah, blah. And then I say, go ahead. And 10 people all start talking at the same time. And when you're transmitting, you can't receive. It's one or the other. So when you start transmitting your call sign, then you can't hear that there are 9 other people also transmitting their call sign. But the guy who's calling CQ is listening to all of this, and he hears 10 people talking. You have to pick out of that mumble jumble, right? The first 2 rows, all of you say your handle all at the exact same time. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Exactly, right? So you're like, rah, 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 right? You have to try and pick out one of the call signs from that mumble jumble of all of those things to talk to the next person. And you call back that one person and go back and forth, right? So it's a lot of fun. It's a challenge. Is it practical? Not really. There's no, I'm not going to make money off of it. It's just fun. It's just a challenge. That's why we do that thing. Does that answer your question? Yeah. So contesting is a way of talking on the air without actually having to make small talk because there's this predefined exchange. So, any other questions? What? Yes. So he said IP as an internet protocol, as in data. So there are a lot of different digital modes that you can do on amateur radio. Some of them are IP based, some of them are not IP based, and I'm going to be talking about some of them that aren't. But I'll go ahead and talk about that one. So the Wi-Fi band, 2.4 gigahertz, right? That's smack dab in the middle of the amateur radio band. When you're using Wi-Fi on your laptop, you're using the non-amateur rules, and there are certain things that you can do when you're using those rules. You can use encryption, but you're only limited to, what's it, like 100 milliwatts or whatever, very low power, and you can't use big external antennas when you're just doing it as a non-ham. But if you want to do it as a ham, you can use the same hardware. You can put an amplifier on it to get more power out of it. You can put a better antenna on it. So you can do all of these things that hams can do with their radio. But you're also restricted to the other rules about amateur radio. You cannot obscure the meaning of your message, which means you can't use encryption. So if you decide when you set up a system, am I going to operate under Part 15 rules, which is what the general public does, or am I going to operate under Part 97 rules, which is the amateur radio rules? And so you have to choose one or the other, and then you are obligated to follow the rules of one or the other at any given time. But yeah, so there are networks set up. Seattle's got a huge one called HamWAN that several of my friends are involved in. But they've got this giant mesh network of IP networks that they all communicate on, and they do a lot of their Aries work on it and stuff like that. And it's all over the amateur bands. It's unencrypted, and it's using high power and directional antennas and all the fun things that hams can do, but Part 15 rules don't allow you to do. So that's a good one. Yep, you're very welcome. All right, so those are some of the fun things that we can do. The other thing that has really gotten me involved in the amateur radio, more deeply involved in amateur radio recently, has been the different technologies that are available and all the learning opportunities that you have, right? There is a lot of technology in amateur radio. A lot of technology came out of amateur radio. I can't remember the guy's name. The guy who runs Qualcomm down in San Diego, he's an amateur radio operator. CDMA came out of amateur radio. So the cellular networks that Verizon uses came out of the mind of an amateur radio operator, and he learned all of the stuff that he used to build that because of amateur radio, right? So we tend not to have very high-tech stuff, as in high bit rates and high speeds and that kind of thing. We tend to go to the other extreme of weak signal, high noise, low bit rates, but very resilient kind of communication. So we're advancing the state of the art in the low bit rate but very high resilience style of digital communications. And there's a huge laundry list of different digital modes that you can use. But some of the most popular ones these days are PSK 31. PSK stands for phase shift keying. 31 is 31 symbols per second. I'm not going to... 31 symbols per second. I'm not going to go into the technical details on these. If you want to, see me after the talk, and I'll happily go into that. But some eyes will start glazing over if I do that now. But PSK 31 is a mode where people sit at a keyboard and chat back and forth with each other. So you say transmit, and you start typing, and your radio keys up, and you hear this little tone. It's kind of a warbling tone, and it goes out over the radio. And then somebody else hears it on the other side, and then when you stop transmitting, then the other person starts transmitting, and you listen to them, and you go back and forth, right? And so the advantage to this is that the decoders for things like PSK 31 can pick a signal out of the noise floor. Like, if you're listening to it, you can't even tell that there's a signal there at all. It just sounds like noise. But text is popping up on your screen because the computer is able to decode that signal that you can't even tell is there because of the technology that we are advancing in PSK 31. There's another one called JT65, which is even slower. It takes 1 minute to do a transmission, and I think you get your call sign and a signal strength and a grid square, and that's about it. So there are very few pieces of information. It's not a conversation. It's a very fixed format thing. But again, it's one of those modes where sometimes you can't even tell that there's a signal there, but the computer is able to decode it. It's amazing. One of the ones that I've been super interested in, and it's actually what triggered this talk, is because A here was asking me about it on Twitter, is a mode called Weak Signal Propagation Reporting, or WHISPER. WHISPER is a mode where you have a beacon. It's not a human that's transmitting, it's a beacon. So I got a little tiny microcontroller at home that just beacons this every once in a while. And it sends out a signal, it gives my call sign, how much power I'm putting out, in my grid square. Maidenhead grid square, kind of look it up. It's basically roughly where you are in the world. And it beacons this, and it's not really expecting any sort of a reply. But there are other stations that are set up with receivers. And I can show you on my phone. It's not going to work. I'm not going to hold it up for you guys. You won't see it. But it shows up on a map. So a lot of people all over the globe are doing this. Hundreds of people are doing this all over the globe. And it gives you a real-time report of how propagation is working. Propagation is a signal traveling through the air, right? So sometimes I can talk from here to DC, but sometimes I can't. It all depends on what's going on up in the ionosphere. And WHISPER is a way of automatically figuring out what the propagation looks like right now. And so there are a lot of these stations transmitting these signals and a lot of stations receiving these signals. And if you've got, if the propagation is good between California and DC, then you'll see a lot of lines drawn between those two areas. But if the propagation's not very good, you won't see very many lines. And so it's this way of automatically generating these reports about what's going on in the ionosphere. And a lot of people have been doing a lot of research based on this data that we're generating. And it cost me like $60, I think, to put together the beacon. And then I just bought a really spiffy receiver recently that was about $250. But you don't have to spend that much money on a receiver. You can get much cheaper receivers that'll do it. I've got it plugged into my Raspberry Pi, which is already on the net anyway, and it, publishes this information, and it's really cool. One of the other things I've been getting into is kits. So hardware is my passion. Electronic engineering has been my passion for a very long time. And I have done digital circuits for a long time. I mean, I started the darknet 5 years ago. I worked in the hardware hacking village for a few years before that. Hardware has been my passion for a long time, but I've never done analog circuits. I've always done digital circuits, computers, microcontrollers, logic gates, that kind of stuff. I've never gotten into analog until recently. And I wanted to do, both headphone amplifiers, which is a totally different topic, and RF. I wanted to learn about radio. Radio is a bit of a black magic. At least it seems that way. You start looking at these circuits and just capacitors and inductors, how does that oscillate in all this stuff? When you're a digital person, you don't think about those sorts of things because digital is very simple. It's either on or off. There is no in between. You don't have to worry about bias currents and all that kind of stuff, right? So I wanted to get into analog circuit design, and I've used radio as a way of doing that. So there are lots of kits you can buy that, they've done all the hard work ahead of time, but they explain how it works. And so you buy the kit, and as you're assembling it, you're reading the instructions, and they talk about what all of the components that you're putting onto the board do, and why they're there, and how they function. And so as you're assembling this thing, you're learning about it. And you're testing, it's like, well, this is just the power supply section, so build this much, and then test it to make sure it works. And then we're going to build the oscillator. You'll build this much, and test it to make sure it works. And as you go, you learn a lot of stuff. I've actually gotten to the point now where I'm starting to design my own circuits. Just because of these kits that I've built, I've learned enough to be able to start making changes to it. It's like, well, that's kind of cool, but I want to be able to control it a different way. And I saw this thing over here from this other kit where they added the controllability by tweaking it this way or whatever, right? I'm waving my hands. And you kind of pick and piece together the different parts, and you build it, and it works. That's pretty cool, right? And so that's something that I've really been getting into. And the last thing that I have on my list is SDR, software-defined radio. So some of you, if you're familiar with SDR, you can buy the New Elect or the RTL dongles. There are all kinds of really inexpensive SDRs, but they're receive only. You can look at what's out there, but you can't send anything, right? If you get a ham license, you are allowed to transmit on several frequencies as well. And there are lots of SDR kits out there that will let you transmit and receive. And so SDR has really opened up boundaries of what we can do. Because before we had SDR, whatever modulation technique or whatever encoding scheme I wanted to come up with, I had to do it in hardware. And it gets expensive, especially if you want to do it to good quality and very repeatable and stuff like that. And so with SDR, sorry, if you don't know what SDR is, it's software-defined radio. So what I do is I take the radio signal, I process it as little as humanly possible, and I stick it into a ADC, analog to digital converter, right? Just like your sound card in your computer. You stick a microphone into it, and it takes the analog signal from the microphone and turns it into a digital signal, right? The exact same thing happens in an SDR, except it's much higher frequency. So you have an antenna, and you plug the antenna into an analog and digital converter, and it takes the RF signal from the antenna and turns it into a digital signal. And now I've got this RF signal in a digital mode that I can write software to do whatever I want with that. And it's the same hardware no matter what modulation technique I use. And so I buy one chunk of hardware, and I can do all of these different things. It's really cool. And that is where a lot of the technology is coming from. I don't think anyone has ever written a piece of hardware to do PSK. PSK has always been done in software. Same with JT65 and Whisper, right? It's all done in software. It has never been done in hardware. So this renaissance of digital modes that we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years has all been because of SDR. It's really neat. That's the end of my notes. Does you guys have any particular questions, or is there any one particular topic you want me to dive into more? Anything? I don't really have a conclusion for you. Thank you very much.